Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots. Bootlicker Shills, Deathly Search, Peasants, Vassals, Meat, Sacks, Minions, Iranians, 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 Iranians. I'm a useful idiot. Welcome. And today I want to talk about Iran, and particularly an article that's come out in Harper's, and articles that have come out about this article in Harper's, about the idea that Iran has never had a nuclear weapons program. And I know there's two schools of thought on this, and unfortunately the school of thought that the Iranians have been working on an atomic bomb for 20 years and is their main goal, and they are on the verge of achieving it. And I happen to be in the other school of thought, and that is the idea that Iran has never pursued a nuclear weapons program, or at least not since the Iranian Islamic Republic has been established. I know it's been documented that there was a new aspiring nuclear weapons program under the Shah, or at least the foundations for one. But now we have a situation where now the world is convinced that Iran has had this nuclear weapons program, and we certainly have certain states like Israel, and particularly Netanyahu, who push very hard for the idea that Iran is on the verge of having a bomb and they must be stopped. And it doesn't matter the fact that we've had 20 years or more of warnings, incessant warnings from Netanyahu year after year, decade after decade, and numerous U.S. congressmen, including Michelle Bachmann, who claim that Iran is on the verge of weeks and months or possibly years to get a nuclear bomb, and it's never happened. And it doesn't matter whether they predicted it 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Nobody seems to bring that up, that they've been lying and wrong all along. So anyway, let's get back to this article. And and I also want to discuss the idea that perhaps I am naive, thinking that the Iranians are so sneaky and are developing a bomb on the sly while they deny it in public, which is this pretty much normal behavior for any state, including Israel, of course. And but Iran, for some reason, has been painted demonically because of certainly because of the last figurehead they have, Ahmadinejad, and this has created this image of Iran, and it helped characterize them. But that said, just to address the issue of naivete, I am not naive, and certainly it is a possibility that Iran is developing a nuclear weapons program and wants to have this parity in the Middle East. But I still suggest that this is not true. But if it turns out to be true, then I guess I'm wrong. But in the meantime, my belief is that they do not have a nuclear program. And as this article points out, they don't have never had a nuclear program. So the question put forward is, has Iran had a nuclear weapons program before? And since the 1980s, Iran was fully prepared to rely entirely on a French-based company for enriched uranium rather than enrich uranium itself. The Reagan administration sought to strangle Iran's nuclear program, which was admitted to be no proliferation threat. By pressuring Germany and France not to cooperate in any way, Iran essentially was forced to enrich its own uranium. And this is used as evidence that Iran has been pursuing nuclear weapons for years. And I find that to be pretty compelling, because the Iran wanted to develop its nuclear power for its legitimate energy needs, which are very substantial. And I've talked about this in other videos about Iran. They have legitimate and big energy needs that they need to fulfill. And a good example of how that works is look at Japan. They have, or had, they're offline now, but 48 nuclear reactors producing all the energy that they needed for their small country. And so for Iran, it seems legitimate that they have those kind of energy needs. So anyway, and it's acknowledged that there was no proliferation threat at the time. So if Iran is denied an arrangement with Germany and France not to enrich uranium outside of the country, then of course they're going to have to pursue that capability themselves. And a lot of the same countries ended up helping them do that. But interesting that the same offer was made by Russia recently, to enrich the uranium outside of the country so they don't get weapons grade. And so this is evidence. This is what's used as evidence that they've been pursuing nuclear weapons for years. It's just the fact that they were pursuing enriched uranium in order to set up nuclear reactors. Fairly simple. So the second part, what about the evidence produced, the so-called evidence? And much of it is based on a cache of documents from a suppressed or a supposed Iranian nuclear scientist. The German intelligence has discredited as fake and probably fabricated by Israel. And so not only do they know it's a fake, not only do they know the source of the fake, but it's been completely discredited, and yet that has been the basis for some sort of confirmation that they are working on a nuclear weapons program, is this fake document. And all of the sites in Iran have been inspected and are under constant surveillance, contrary to the same byline that we saw leading up to the Iraqi invasion about the refusal for inspections. And so they play up this whole idea that, oh, they're refusing inspections and they won't let us into these secret places. And once again, I'm not naive. I don't want to rule that out, but certainly didn't turn out to be true in Iraq, did it? And so let's move it on to number 3. How about the fact that the International Atomic Energy Agency endorses this narrative of an Iranian nuclear weapons program? Well, WikiLeaks documents show an active collaboration of the United States government and officials at the International Atomic Energy Agency, undermining the statements by then IAEA head and the new head of the IAEA in 2009, which was firmly in the U.S. propaganda camp. So in other words, they just replaced the head of the IAEA and then got the results they wanted. And we see this be on plenty of occasions where we see even the United Nations working with the U.S. in order to substantiate false claims of chemical weapons in Syria, or at least who they're used by. And that's why we end up with this confusion about whether the chemical weapons are used by the government, whether they're used by the rebels, and back and forth. So let's go on to number 4. How come even after the Iraq weapons of mass destruction story has been so roundly discredited, why is the Iran story so easily sold again? And that's a good question. How come all the people who, they bought the Iraq story, and now everyone knows that we were lied to about that, and yet the same tactic is being used again, and it's working on the same people that were fooled before, and yet for some reason this time it's more believable. And I'm afraid, certainly for me, it's not any more believable than it was last time, and it was pretty unbelievable even at that time. So the doctrine of just, and this is an important part of this story, the doctrine of just putting the idea in everyone's head is enough. It doesn't matter if it's found out to be untrue later, because the objective has been acquired. And that's what we found out in Iraq, and they're using the same strategy with Iran. Basically the idea that by the time anybody figures it out, it'll be too late and the objective will have been achieved. And even the most benign and ambiguous developments can be demonized. And that's certainly what we see in the Iraq situation, and we see again in the Iran situation. It's just these small little developments that are so demonized and turn into this major event, whether it's Yellow Cape from Nigeria or agents meeting in European cafes, and until what we find is that intelligence follows policy, not policy following intelligence. And so this is what we have now. They develop a policy, and then they find the intelligence are fabricated in order to sustain that policy, not the other way around. And let's go on to number 5. How about the media coverage of Iraq versus Iran? And as we find out, media is completely towing the government-fed narrative. That's exactly what we saw in Iran. That's with Iraq, and that's exactly what we're seeing with Iran. They're totally on board with it, and why not? For them, of course, when we have a good war, the ratings go through the ceiling. And New York Times and Washington Post under Bush, 2007, 2008, the same thing. And so let's go on to number 6. What effect on the negotiations? The nuclear negotiations going on with Iran now, that a lot of the so-called evidence and information that the United States is using is fraudulent. Well, first of all, I would add myself that it probably doesn't matter, since the United States knows the claims are fraudulent, and they're just going to demand a certain agenda that either one opens up Iran to the U.S. in ways that they would like, or undermines their programs, or just keeps the negotiations going in the direction the United States wants them to. So what we find out is the U.S. has absorbed Israel's narrative into its proposal. And so they want to cripple Iran's legitimate energy needs. And that's why it's going to be problematic getting these negotiations done, because Iran probably is aware, if you adapt my viewpoint and other pundits, that they don't have nuclear weapons. It's problematic for them to deal with the United States in these negotiations, knowing that they don't have nuclear weapons, and the U.S. Negotiating with them knowing that they don't have nuclear weapons. And a lot of this idea of the threat of Iran is tied up in the concept of breakout. And it's the idea that they can suddenly assemble all the materials and have everything ready, and then have a no turning back breakout moment where they have a nuclear bomb. And we have countries like Japan that have that capability. They have everything pretty much, as far as I understand, set up that they could assemble nuclear weapons in a very short amount of time, ironically. So this supposed breakout moment, but that's another thing that's been problematic, and I'll attach my video below about how there's been predictions for 20 years that Iran is on this breakout moment. So if they've been using this breakout moment scenario for 20, 25, 30 years, why isn't it any more true now than it has been before? And if they were so close before in those breakout moments, why don't they already have a nuclear bomb? We've been told time and time again for 20, 30 years that they're on the verge of a bomb. So let's see it. But it's not there. And then another problematic aspect is the fact that most of the uranium that Iran is producing right now is converted to a form that makes it unusable for nuclear weapons. And this is an article that appeared a year or so ago, and it talked about the fact that they were channeling a lot of this into medical uses, and something that the United States is well aware of, and uses the same technology. And then some of the other aspects of this too is a good example of this claim by Khomeini and the Iranian government that they are against nuclear weapons, and just on a religious base. And in some ways, there's evidence to prove this, because first of all, Iran has not been certainly directly involved in the affairs of other countries or attacked other countries. Certainly, like all modern nations, certainly in that region, they've been involved in proxy wars, and everybody's doing it. It's all the rage. But let's remember that during the Iraq-Iran war of the 80s, the Iraq government under Saddam Hussein used huge amounts of chemical weapons against Iranians, and there was horrible atrocities and horrible casualties. And yet, during that entire decade of war, the Iranians never used chemical weapons in return. And so this shows a remarkable restraint under the circumstances, and so gives some evidence that perhaps they do not have nuclear weapons and are not pursuing them. So anyway, just something to consider. I know it's not a popular viewpoint, but I think this article and this book that it promotes are good things to digest, particularly because in the last year or two, of course, we've been in a scenario where we've been on the verge of an attack on Iran, and there's been a lot of speculation about an attack on Iran, and what a grave tragedy that would be. And if it turns out, like Iraq, that they never had a nuclear weapons program, it will be all the bigger tragedy. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.